Caleb Bingham's famous series of paintings called The Flatboatman begs for a song. We'll see.
Oh, I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee, and I'm going to Louisiana, my true love for to see.
Can you hear this?
Oh, Susanna, now don't you cry for me, for I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. Oh, it rained all night the day I left, the weather was so dry, the sun so hot I froze to death. Susanna, don't you cry.
Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. One more.
I had a dream the other night when everything was still. I thought I saw Susanna coming down the hill. Oh, Susanna, now don't you cry for me.
Come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. One more. Susanna, don't you cry. Susanna, don't you cry for me. I come from Alabama with my banjo on my knee. Stephen Foster is sometimes called the father of American popular music. Whoops, she's still singing down here. Jesus. There we go. As though it needed a father. He was certainly the most popular in the middle of the 19th century. He wrote O Susanna in 1847 in the midst of the Mexican War. Foster was born in Pittsburgh or just outside of Pittsburgh. He was born on the same day that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died, July 4th, 1826. He was proud of that, apparently. His father was a drunk and was ruined by lawsuits. He had a rough childhood. He was a wanderer, a dreamer, a romantic. He wrote a lot of parlor songs, too, that people like to play on pianoforte, but they didn't sell. Popular songs, especially minstrel songs, especially songs in black dialect. That song, O Susanna, of course, the singer, the voice, is either a former slave or a slave who's from Louisiana and is going back to find his Susanna. Foster made his career writing minstrelsy, but so did a whole lot of other people, white and black. It was blackface minstrel songs on which he made his career, not just O Susanna. Camptown Races. Come on. Doo-da, doo-da. This takes me back to 7th grade chorus. I don't know about you. We did all kinds of Stephen Foster back then. That's I guess, where I learned. And, of course, Old Kentucky Home, which has become the anthem of the Kentucky Derby. And everybody in Kentucky just weeps when they sing that. It's a very controversial song. All of these are now, because they all, if you go deep into the, and by the way, that was a totally cleaned up version of O Susanna. There are many racist lyrics in that song, depending on which ones you sing. In my 7th grade chorus, we didn't use the N-word that I remember. I hope. He wrote Beautiful Dreamer, for God's sake. I mean, my mother used to sing that to me. And on and on and on. The songbook of Stephen Foster goes. But what's in a blackface minstrel song? It's in part the nostalgia for somewhere else. There's the tunes, which of course are irresistible. You can't resist the tunes, the melodies of a Stephen Foster song. Frederick Douglass admitted that. Douglass hated blackface minstrelsy. Hated it. But he admitted that Stephen Foster had softened, he said, the racism in it. Well, he also wrote Swanee River. And some of you may know there's a whole museum devoted to that song, Swanee River, on the Swanee River in North Florida, where I'm told by a Floridian, Stephen Foster never set foot in Florida. But that's all right. Now, of course, he also wrote I Dream of Jeannie. We could go on and on here. But that kind of popular tune was all over the country by the early 1850s. There was a journalist in San Francisco who wrote and said, you know, Stephen Foster's O Susanna is sung by everybody out here. Miners, immigrants of all kinds. He says it seems to be, the only thing that seems to unite these crazy different Americans is, quote, Negro melodies. And it's true. The Negro melodies, also known as blackface minstrelsy, was the most popular form of entertainment throughout the 19th century. There's a brand new book about to come out by Raylan Barnes called Darkology. Odd title, but it makes sense after a while. I recommend it. But at the same time, there's all this nostalgia in the middle of the 19th century for home, for old-timey places, the home you've left behind, the girl you've left behind. There's slavery. In all the ways that it's seeped into the culture, all the ways that it's seeped into the American imagination. Students in the class and anyone else, you're reading Douglass's narrative for this week. The greatest of all the slave narratives. Narrative published in 1845, just on the eve of the Mexican War. Douglass liked to sing. He eventually became a decent violinist. Not even close to his grandson, Joseph, who was a great concert violinist. But there's the passage in the narrative which you'll read. Well, there's several passages about slave music and black music, but there's the one where Douglass has gathered his band of brothers, he calls them, on the Freeland farm out on the eastern shore. This is the last place he had been hired out to for a full year, and he takes his buddies out into the brush arbors on Sundays and he teaches them preaching. But they also would sing, and he remembers some of the songs they sang. They sang, "O Canaan, sweet Canaan, I'm bound for the land of Canaan," which is a dreamy, spiritual. Nobody knows the origin of that one, like most of the spirituals. That dreamy song about getting north or getting somewhere called Canaan, getting somewhere where slavery doesn't exist. And then he remembers right after that that they also sang the song, "I thought I heard them say there were lions in the way. I don't expect to stay much longer here. Run to Jesus, shun the danger. I don't expect to stay much longer here." And then there's the section in the narrative, look for it. In my edition, it comes right after the aerial photograph of the Y plantation, where Douglass remembers as a child when he was 6 and 7. It was called Allowance Day. And on Allowance Day, all the slaves on the great Y plantations, and there were about 300 of them, all across the landscape on the various farms owned by Colonel Lloyd, they had one day a month where they came to the great house, the big house, the Y house, which is still there, to get their allowances for the month of corn, feed, of flour, of lots of other goods. But as they came, they sang. And Douglas remembers as a child that he couldn't understand these mysterious, bizarre songs and moans he would hear from the woods. But then he says, in retrospect, the writer of 1845, in retrospect, he says, if you want to understand the hearts of the slaves, go stand in the piney woods on Allowance Day at the Y House and listen to the songs. Listen to the song if you want to understand slavery. Americans were singing all the time. Some of their writers could sing. More on Walt Whitman in a moment. But Herman Melville starts writing, we can't be sure, but he seems to have written most of Moby Dick between the spring of 1850 and the fall of 1851, just as the country was battling it out over the Compromise of 1850, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. That bizarre, philosophical, metaphysical, very long, very weird at times, novel about a Captain Ahab, a ship named the Pequod, and his almost unbelievable obsession with finding a white whale. Melville, as a young man, was an aspiring writer. He wanted to make a living as a writer. He never really succeeded at that until he was long dead. He'd sold some sailing stories that didn't do too bad. White Jacket, Redburn, a few others. But he began to then write these dark allegories with no redemption, which Americans don't like. And Melville may have known that, but Melville had to be Melville. He finally moved out. He left where he lived in upstate New York, and he moved to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts near Lenox. Bought a little farm with a loan, really a gift from his father-in-law. And he decided to try to write a novel based on a true story of a crazy captain who had an obsession with finding the killer white whale. Who is Captain Ahab in 1851? Was he an Israelite king? Was he somehow Melville's epitome of the American slaveholder? That crew are enslaved. Is he the tyrant doomed by ambition? Is he that obsessed ruler exploiting the ruled for his unworldly goals and conquests? Ahab has been everything and anything people have wanted to make him. Is he Adolf Hitler? Well, not yet in 1851. But there's this long list among Melville scholars of who Melville was anticipating. Was he Joe Stalin? Fill in the blank. Melville he plunged into reading in the late 40s, during the Mexican War, plunged into reading Goethe and Milton and Virgil and Shakespeare and the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and many others. He started reading these obscure whaling manuals, hence all those chapters in Moby Dick that are all about the details of whaling. How do you extract the blubber, and what do you do with the blubber, and what's the content of the blubber? Those chapters people tend to kind of skip through to get to the big stuff. The crew of the Pequod is, of course, the United Nations. It's the most pluralistic society afloat. The sailors from all over the world, they're all colors, they're all religions, they're Native Americans, they're Asians, they're Africans. They have bizarre names. They mostly get along. Ahab chased whales as Americans chased territory and land. That's what Andy Delbanco says in his magnificent biography of Melville. But this great sailing story, this great whale story, this great sea story is not going to have redemption. And when you read Moby Dick, you begin to think that, because Ahab is just so bloody crazy. Herman Melville made $556.37 in royalties on Moby Dick. And it faded into obscurity. He wrote his last novel in the late 1850s, and he quit writing fiction. Couldn't make a living at it. Finally found a job at the Port Authority in New York. Would be rediscovered, of course, in the 1920s and 30s for having written possibly the greatest novel in American literature, certainly the greatest tragic novel, although there's some competitors for that. Just one passage from Moby Dick. Melville is not sending us into nostalgia. Melville is not saying this is a land always progressing, always improving, always growing. Melville's America is in trouble. And right after Moby Dick, he's going to write, and right after the Compromise of 1850, he's going to write Benito Sereno, that little novella, that kind of a long short story about a slave ship. And America's on those decks too. In what some scholars call the greatest chapter in Moby, and people read Moby Dick by the I keep Moby Dick by the bed usually, although I couldn't find it there last night. It was somewhere else on a shelf. Actually, it was on my desk. I sometimes lose where my Moby Dick is, and I really get bent out of shape when that happens. It's like not knowing where my leaves of grass is when I need it. Whoops. My fault. There's a chapter called The Quarterdeck. And that's the chapter in which Ahab draws the whole crew out late into the night, just before dawn, the whole crew. And he has his 3 officers stand up front. And Starbuck can't take it. Starbuck, you may remember, yes, the coffee's named after him. And so are a hell of a lot of other things named for people and places and things in Moby Dick. We don't even know it. It's like quoting Shakespeare, but you don't know you are. Anyway, and it's the moment when Ahab tells the crew why they're on this ship. You're on this ship because I'm chasing the white whale. And you are going with me. And he asks them to get their harpoons and hold their harpoons high. And they can't resist him. They can't resist this tyrant, this absolutely dominating, domineering, frightful, terrifying tyrant. And what choice do they have? They're out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me, says Ahab. He convinces them, or most of them, that his quest, his obsession is now their obsession. The followers follow, all except Starbuck. Starbuck's a businessman. He's the first officer. He wants to get back to Nantucket and make a profit, thank you very much. And he challenges Ahab. It doesn't work, though. And then there's this little paragraph where Melville says, oh, by the way, Ahab orders somebody to go down below and bring up the grog. And they're all going to pass the pewter mug and drink the grog. And they're going to have a second round and third round. And they're toasting, in effect, Ahab's tyrannical quest. Receiving the brimming pewter and turning to the harpooners, he ordered them to produce their weapons. Then ranging them before him near the capstan, with their harpoons in their hands, while his three mates stood at his side with their lances, and the rest of the ship's company formed a circle around the group, he stood for an instant searchingly eyeing every man of his crew. But those wild eyes met his, as the bloodshot eyes of the prairie wolves meet the eye of their leader ere he rushes on at their head in the trail of a bison, but alas, only to fall into the hidden snare of the Indians. They're going to follow Ahab now. They can't resist. They like a strong man. Americans should be reading about Ahab. Well, Walt Whitman was born in Brooklyn, New York. I didn't put up a picture of Uncle Walt, sorry, but quickly put, Whitman is beginning to write Leaves of Grass at the same time as the Mexican War. He wandered all over New York, Long Island, Manhattan, Staten Island, every part of New York he traversed on foot. He had all kinds of jobs as a young man. He worked as an editor. He wrote a temperance novel at one point to try to make a buck or two. He was a carpenter in particular. He framed houses, and when he'd break for lunch, he'd go sit on stoops or on walls or something and write poems. Walt Whitman wrote poetry for everyone, of everyone, and about everything. He could still be called the most American of poets. There are no rhymes in it. He only wrote one poem that ever rhymed. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," about Lincoln's murder. There's no formal scheme to his poems. You can dive in. You can almost read it backward. There's no meter. There are no allusions to any European writers. He's not rewriting somebody. He's all he needs. Whitman welcomed everyone and by and large did not judge anyone. He loved men and he loved women. "I behold God in every object," Whitman wrote. "Yet I understand God not in the least." I think that's endeared him over time to modernists, if it didn't in his own time. To Whitman, people were human and imperfect and divine. Divine in imperfection. And he famously said, of course, "I contain multitudes." Now, he gathered together the first batch of poems. He called it Leaves of Grass. He published it with a nice green cover. To Walt. In 1855, been working on it for years, he sent a copy to Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was his hero, the great essayist. They'd never met. But it was like Whitman was fanboy of Emerson. And Emerson tells us that he, on the 4th of July in 1855, he had draped his house and his gate out front with black drapery, as many did around New England, protesting the Kansas-Nebraska Act. More on that next time. But that day, the mailman delivered a little package, and he opened it up, and it was Leaves of Grass, signed by Walt Whitman. It's if you're into literary imagination, what a moment! My God, Emerson is opening his copy of Leaves, and he started reading it. It was the most unusual poetry he'd ever seen. And then he wrote Whitman a letter. He says, "This is the most American. You're the most American of poets." He said, This poetry is a combination of the Bhagavad Gita and the New York Herald." He said it was the most beautiful form of American Buddhism he'd ever seen. Emerson, away with words. If you want to walk with Walt Whitman, understand Walt Whitman, read Song of Myself, all 55 pages. Just stay with it. Let it pull you, drag you to its incredible conclusion where he says, "I will be buried under your feet. I will be under the leaves and under the dirt. I am an American under the dirt." But also, if you want to grasp Whitman, listen to Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, and then read Song of the Open Road. If you want to see Whitman's endurance, listen to Springsteen's Thunder Road, or read half the poems of Langston Hughes. Now, Whitman was not a perfect Democrat, small d, but he is a prophet of our democracy. Without a doubt, that's where Song of Myself is this almost unfathomable, endless celebration of the democratic. "I will have nothing," Whitman said, "that my fellow persons do not also have the same thereof." It's my favorite definition of, everyone's got their favorite definition of democracy now. That's mine. Oh, democracy, for you I am trilling these songs. We've been talking about democracy ever since it's been in the United States, ever since this experiment's been imagined, and it is some of our poets, our writers, our songwriters, our musicians, our artists who help us grasp that. Why do we have art? So that we don't die of reality. Somebody said that. It wasn't me. Well, okay. Uncle Walt will come back to us in the next coming weeks. Emily Dickinson is up in Amherst, Massachusetts, writing her own unusual, sometimes rhyming, beautifully crafted, formalistic poems about her garden, about nature, about sometimes a single flower she sees through her bedroom window, and eventually about her imaginations beyond that garden, beyond Amherst, Massachusetts, and eventually 1/3 of her entire collection of poetry will be written in the 4 years of the Civil War, when she was terrified by the war beyond the boundaries of her town, where her brother was serving. And then there's the incredible poet, not recognized enough, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Born free in the North, Frances Watkins, as she was first known, published a collection of poetry in the 1850s that sold 9,000 copies. Why? Whitman perhaps should have written more about slavery because Americans wanted to read about slavery. That's why the slave narratives were so popular. That's why Frederick Douglass's narrative was a bestseller by any definition. The first narrative sold 35,000 copies in the first 4 years it was in print. That's a bestseller. Hell, that's almost a bestseller today. But Frances Ellen Watkins wrote a fairly long poem. I'll only give you 2 verses that people were drawn to. It was called Bury Me in a Free Land. I could not rest if I heard the tread of a coffle gang to shambles led, and the mother's shriek of wild despair rise like a curse on the trembling air. I could not sleep if I saw the lash drinking her blood at each fearful gash, and I saw her babes torn from her breast like trembling doves from their parents' nest. Women, children, babes, families was at the heart, had always been at the heart of the anti-slavery message, the anti-slavery argument, especially in its moral, suasionist early stages. Now, I mentioned that there was a war going on. Whoops. There we are. One of the things, of course, and Joanne dealt with this, and by the way, I'm sorry Joanne's lectures are over, aren't you? Yeah. I learned a lot from her lectures in substance. I also learned something in style. I'll tell you about it later. And I'm not good at learning, so I'm probably still going to commit all my own sins. I'm not quite as carefully organized as you, and I need to learn that. But anyway, one of the things that made westward expansion, of course, possible was Indian removal. And one of the things that's going to make the Mexican War possible, among others, like the theory of manifest destiny, the notion that somehow this continent was meant to be owned, possessed, conquered, owned, and possessed by Americans, preferably white Americans, in the service of their conception of liberty. But Indian removal, the removal of the 5 larger tribes, nations of the Southeast, to Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory in the beginning in the late 1820s, but especially through the 1830s, is part of what's going to just fuel this westward movement, because it's going to start bringing American settlers in droves into Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas and East Texas. And Texas is going to become the rub, of course. Oops. Oh, Blight. Slow down. Okay. We'll come back to this map, but it simply shows you where Indian Territory is. It shows you Kansas and Nebraska territories. That is everything that's left by 1850 of the original Louisiana Purchase. And it is going to become the most contested, politically contested ground, and eventually violently contested ground in North America between Americans, who are now becoming polarized. And by the way, we think we're polarized? We did not invent that term. Well, polarized is, of course, a very useful word. You can have polarized families, you can have polarized schools, you can have polarized whatever. Greatest book, I think, still ever written on the 1850s, the political crises of the 1850s. It's a monster. 700 pages, long before they had word processors. This was by David Potter, who taught here for years until the 60s. David Potter's impending crisis, in the opening chapter, which deals with the late 1840s into the 50s, he can't stop using the word polarizing. And I guess I'd never even underlined it until the recent years. We didn't create that word at all. The importance of slavery in all three of these aspects, and by that he meant economic, social, and moral values, and all three of these aspects is evident further in its polarizing effect upon sections. No other sectional factor could have brought about this effect the same way. The oldest cliche we have now is that slavery caused the Civil War, but Potter's argument, so beautifully put together, is it's slavery that brought together this cluster of problems: expansion, different economies, differing moral values, political power, a sense of the future, free labor versus slave labor, the fanfare for the common man, free labor ideology, which we'll come back to. All of these things kind of clustered around this problem of the future of slavery. Would this country remain a slave society or not? Potter says slavery forced Americans to have what he called a distorted mental image of each other. Did you wake up feeling polarized today? Did you look in the mirror and think, well, I'm not quite as polarized as I was yesterday? What's your polarized quotient this week? Thus, the slavery issue, writes Potter, gave a false clarity and simplicity to sectional diversities, which were otherwise qualified and diffuse. One might say that the issue structured and polarized many random, unoriented points of conflict, which sectional interest diverged, and eventually, as he says, resulted in combat. That's kind of the story of the 1850s, and perhaps our story too, and not just now, but at other times. When do we face issues that are so polarizing that we run out of ways to compromise them? We run out of ways to solve them. We run out of any way to find resolution, reconciliation, and the like. Now, just a quick look here at, I did a survey years ago when I was doing a book on the Underground Railroad, a book of essays, but it was for the Smithsonian, and they allowed me like 250 illustrations, which was amazing for a book, and they were willing to pay for it. I wouldn't be able to now, but so I was just scouring, and I had the help of one former research assistant. I was scouring through everything I could find for images of slavery and images of abolitionism. And it was a totally unscientific survey, but I found that there were three primary subjects of artists in the 19th century, whether they were painting or doing lithographs or any other representation of the slavery issue. One was the runaway slave. Lots of images of the runaway in the wilderness, chased by dogs, up a tree, crossing a river, Eliza on the icebergs of the Ohio River. The second was the lash. Images of whippings, the lash, violence. And the third was the slave auction. Painters couldn't resist. This is an 1850s painting of a slave auction in St. Louis. Oh, it's very pretty, isn't it? And the very light-skinned slave woman is exceedingly well-dressed for a slave auction, but she's the object. But then we look a little lower, and of course we see little children, boys and girls, being examined. If we could span out on this painting, we'd see lots of other sort of hideous images, the faces even on the guys bidding at the auction. There was something about a slave auction that made it an unforgettable image if you ever saw one, and hence it drew artists. Because hundreds of thousands of people were sold like this. Now, these are real people, though. That's a photograph taken during the Civil War of an extended enslaved family, I think in Virginia. No, South Carolina, sorry. And we have many of these. All right, Mr. Polk's War. That's Mr. Polk. He's one of the first presidents ever photographed, not the first. I think John Quincy Adams is the first, although he wasn't photographed until after he was president. Maybe Van Buren, not sure. Don't quote me on this. Joanne probably knows which president's the first. I don't know. But anyway, America is poised to expand west. I mean, no question about it. Watch out. And in the wake of Jackson and his appointed successor, Martin Van Buren, they had to face the 1844 election, and Henry Clay was running again, as he always did, as the Whig candidate for president. Henry Clay ran at least 3 times, could have been 4, depending on how you count them, never won. And James K. Polk became the candidate of the Democratic Party in 1844, in part because they were looking for a new voice, a new image. They called him Little Hickory instead of Young Hickory instead of Old Hickory, which was Jackson's nickname. The Calhounites in that Democratic Party, the followers of John C. Calhoun, the intellectual leader of the pro-slavery cause, wanted a real slaveholder, as they put it. And Martin Van Buren had not only not been a real slaveholder, he wasn't a slaveholder at all. Clay, as the Whig candidate, was for expansion, but he wanted it to be a negotiated expansion. They would negotiate with Native Americans. They would negotiate with Mexicans. They would negotiate with the Brits about the North. They would negotiate their way westward. You can imagine what the Democrats and the old Jacksonians did with that. Negotiate? Are you kidding? Yeah. I was going to say something about Pete Hegseth there, but I held it back. Now, it was a very close election. And Polk ran on an expansionist platform. Elect me, elect us, and we will give you Oregon. Elect us, and we will give you Texas and maybe Mexico. We're going west. And it's our destiny to do it. It's our manifest destiny to do it. There are still biographies of James K. Polk published. I found one yesterday in the library. Why was I looking up James? I don't know. I was just there in the stacks. There's a 2001 biography of James K. Polk that still uses that term destiny in the title as part of that expansionist era. Polk won very narrowly in 1844 by only 36,000 votes out of 2.8 million cast. He barely won New York. Van Buren and the Democrats sort of helped him there, and that put him over the top. Without New York, he doesn't win. But why did he win New York? Because there was a third party in this election. It was the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was the first version of a genuine, mostly genuine, anti-slavery political party. Born first in 1836, and they're still hanging around, and they're running a candidate. And what did they do but get 2.5% of the vote? How many of you remember the election of 2000? What percent did Ralph Nader get? 3%. Who won? Anyway, never mind. Supreme Court won that one. But the Liberty Party got 2.5% of the vote. And they threw New York State to Polk because they took votes away from Clay. And Abraham Lincoln, now still a pretty obscure lawyer out in Illinois, but because of the Mexican War, he's going to join politics again. He's going to run for Congress and serve one term. Abraham Lincoln never forgave the Liberty Party for ruining Henry Clay's last best chance to be president. Henry Clay was his hero. Lincoln was a Whig. He always blamed, like some of us, if you give us a chance, we'll still badmouth. I just named him once, that's enough. So Polk becomes president. And immediately before he was inaugurated, his predecessor, John Tyler of Virginia, pushed through the annexation of Texas, not by a negotiated treaty, not by any frankly legitimate way, where it would have required 2/3 vote of the U.S. Senate, which they never could have achieved. They simply passed quickly a joint resolution of Congress, which required only majorities in both. The House voted 120 to 98 to admit Texas as a state. The Senate voted 27 to 25 to admit Texas as a state. Everybody knew it would become a slave state, and a big one. And that's how Polk enters the presidency. Of the 11, he's the 11th president of the United States. There he is, standing in the front with that big tie. He's the only president, so far as we know, who bought and sold slaves from the Oval Office. He had a broker who would come in and he'd deal, and they'd send out the message. He bought and sold in the White House. He was the 7th of the first 11 presidents to be a slaveholder. He was aggressive toward Mexico, to say the least. He ordered American troops quickly down to the Rio Grande River under Zachary Taylor near Matamoros, Mexico, which according to the Mexicans was on Mexican land, because Mexico only acknowledged the border, if they acknowledged it at all, as the Nueces River. I think I have a good map here. You can't see this terribly well, but you can see the Rio Grande is the current border, of course, and there it is. But just above that, about 100 miles, is the Nueces River. Mexico is pretty much willing to acknowledge that as some kind of border. Polk put the troops south of that. They tried to negotiate with each other, the Americans and the Mexicans, but they had to do it in French because the Mexicans didn't speak English, the Americans didn't speak Spanish. They tried the diplomacy language of French, and that didn't work terribly well either because nobody was terribly good at French. But anyway, it didn't work. There was a 3-week standoff, and then on April 24, 1846, Mexican cavalry moved well above the Rio Grande, attacked American troops, killed American troops. And the news, though it took 3 weeks to get to Washington, D.C., no social media, no anything, the news gets to Washington. America is at war. Huh? Say some. How'd that happen? Hostilities had commenced, announced James K. Polk. Americans have been killed on American soil. And in Congress, overnight, there was this kind of rally to support the troops. We've lived through plenty of those. Support the troops. They're vulnerable. They've been attacked. They've been killed. And Polk asked for a declaration of war. They still declared wars in those years. And they did. The House said, they didn't even call it a declaration. They said they recognized the war. 174 to 14 in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, it was 40 to 2. However, there were dozens of abstentions. And the reasons for the abstentions, of course, were from Northerners who hated this idea of an expansionist war because they believed it was an expansionist war for slavery. I only have a minute or two. Now, the war was bloody. About 13,000 Americans died in the next 2 years, fighting from Veracruz to Mexico City, fighting from Monterrey all the way across the heart of Mexico, fighting even in what is now New Mexico. Most Americans who died in this war died of disease. Approximately 50,000 Mexicans. And you go talk to historically minded Mexicans about what we call the Mexican War. They don't tend to call it that. They lost as many people in that war as we lost in Vietnam, or almost. That's how bloody it was for Mexicans. It was a war of conquest. And the United States won, to say the least, and forced a treaty. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which brought to the United States what became known as the Mexican Cession, which is everything from Texas westward to California, northward to Colorado, part of Utah, what is now modern Arizona and New Mexico, the entire American Southwest, the largest land acquisition of American history after the Louisiana Purchase. It was not popular in large parts of the North. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson who said, "We may conquer Mexico, but Mexico will poison us." And by that he meant the political cohesion of the United States, whatever's left of political unity. And then there was Abraham Lincoln, who by 1848, and he voted against every resolution for the Mexican War. There's Abraham Lincoln who said this, that young whippersnapper. He called it Polk's War, Mr. Polk's War. And he said, Polk's justification is a half-insane mumbling of a fever dream. That's polarization. That's the diminishing of your foe, your opponent, your enemy. This is nothing but a fever dream to the expansion of slavery. All right. I'll leave you there, but Americans went to this war willingly. They were wearing what they called Palo Alto hats. They sang new versions of Yankee Doodle. Joanne knows the origin of that song. I don't. They had all kinds of new songs, and they had a new thing called war correspondence. It was the first war ever covered by American journalists on site. And it became this festival in some ways in the political culture of this idea that it was somehow America's manifest destiny to conquer the West, whatever it took. And immediately in its wake, in the signing of that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Americans of both sides, both parties, and there's now an even stronger third anti-slavery party called the Free Soil Party, which is going to win 10% of the vote in 1848. That's trouble. They got to come to Washington now and try to figure out what to do with that great Mexican cession. What will all that territory become? Slave territory, free territory, or something else? How will they settle it, reconcile it, depolarize it? Next time we'll see.